Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on space and terrestrial health and the case for space biosciences innovation in the UK. Today's event is a collaboration between UK Space Labs and SJC's Space Medicine and Life Sciences Group. So before we begin, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Zainab, and I'll be hosting today's session. I'm the engagement and social media team lead at UK Space Labs, and I'm also a workshop coordinator at SJC's SMLS, where I'm currently co-coordinating the systematic review project. So UK Space Labs is an organisation that promotes the research of space life and biomedical sciences in the UK, and SJC SMLS aims to provide students and young professionals that have an interest in space biomedical science with an international and interdisciplinary platform. So it's great to see so many of you here today. I think we've got over 50 people, so that's really good, and I hope you'll find this an informative and exciting event. This topic is increasingly relevant because space and terrestrial health inform each other, and space research often relies heavily on terrestrial studies, for example, Bedrest studies, but it's also key to understand how space research can help us understand our biology while our feet are firmly planted on the ground. So today's speakers will hopefully give you an insight into the work and research that is ongoing in this field, and there'll be a chance to ask our speakers any questions that you have. So please do engage and write your questions in the chat box. And can I also please ask that you keep your microphones off for the duration of the webinar. So the format of today's event will be a series of talks followed by 5 minutes of questions from the audience. So please write them in the chat, and we'll have a short break between the first and second half, because our second half will be an update on the UK Space Labs reference paper, where we'll be receiving short talks from key contributors of the paper, and this segment will be led by Dr. Phil Carvil. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, so I'm going to stop talking and let this give their talks. And I'd like to introduce our first talk, which will be on analog environments and disaster risk reduction. So this talk will be by Dr. Lucas Rehnberg and Myles Harris. So Dr. Lucas Rehnberg is an anaesthetic and intensive care doctor in Southampton and obtained his master's from King's College London, writing his dissertation on CPR in microgravity. Lucas continues to have research interests in space life sciences, both conducting research and teaching as part of the Space Life Sciences team at Innovaspace. And Myles Harris is a PhD candidate at UCL's Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. He is a nurse by background and has a master's in education. And Myles is researching prolonged field care in remote environments, including space. So thank you both for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much. That was a very nice introduction. Just checking, can you hear me before I carry on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks for inviting me along today. Privileged to be able to talk on this platform, and great to see so many people joining the webinar. So I'll dive right in. So yeah, by day, medical doctor here in the UK. I also enjoyed dabbling in a bit of space life sciences, working with the Austrian Space Forum and Innovaspace, and that's where my experience comes in, with working with analog environments and analog missions. Myles is also part of the Austrian Space Forum, and with his expertise sort of at UCL, he's sort of helping us develop sort of protocols for sort of disaster risk management for sort of our ongoing analog missions, but I'll let him talk a little bit more about that at the end. So my job in a short space of time is to tell you what are analogs and why do we use them. Right, like this picture sort of sets the scene. You know, this is the dream, this is what we're aiming for, sort of to re-establish a human presence on the moon and going on to Mars and trying to have a sustained human presence on the moon, you know, the view to potentially do some mining and have habitats there. These missions are hugely complex, years, decades in the making, and we can't really afford to do our learning sort of on the moon or on Mars, and you can only learn so much from sort of previous experiences of the Apollo missions, and it's much more safe and affordable and cost effective to learn, test, train in terrestrial analog environments, for which we've got lots, which I'll touch on, with varying levels of risk and fidelity, from which we sort of can extract and get lots of data to help build up our knowledge and understanding of what it would be like going on to these exploration class missions. So what are analogues? It's a very broad term. It covers a whole spectrum. I'll specifically be talking about analog planetary research. Analogues as anything that simulates sort of space or the microgravity environment in any way. That includes parabolic flights and Bedrest studies that Julia will sort of talk about a little bit later on. But I'm specifically talking about these Moon and Mars sort of analog missions, these terrestrial analogues. They're a great research bed, and they can test a whole spectrum of scientific interests. So not just of the physiology and the psychology, but there's the engineering, the geological testing of sort of robotic human interaction, software, technology and hardware. And this is all sort of adding to our knowledge and building up that global sort of knowledge of human exploration. I've touched on a little bit of why we use them. So it is just a lot more cost effective. To date, there's been less than 600 astronauts have flown, and there's only so much scientific data that you can sort of extract from that. So analog missions just provide us with this cost-effective way of being able to run lots of missions in a shorter space of time. It's a lot cheaper, and it's also a lot safer in testing or proof of concepts and risk assessments before sending them up to the ISS or sending them to the moon. And then a big part of these missions as well is sort of education and outreach. The space race highlighted that it's a great way to galvanize a nation. So analog missions are a great way to sort of outreach, particularly sort of STEM outreach, to sort of engage communities or international communities to have sort of ongoing interest. So oh, there we go. So it's difficult to classify analogues. There's no one unifying sort of classification system, but so there's sort of a few agreed ways of sort of dividing them up and looking at them in a different way. So the environment is an obvious one. If it's a hot, cold environment, altitude, remote. Human factors, again, some missions have different outcomes and different specific scientific aims, which are sort of well in advance of the mission going ahead. Things like one example being sort of the Mars 500. Human physiology is slightly harder, particularly in these terrestrial environments. Is probably the biggest sort of disadvantage, is that replicating that change in the gravitational field of the Moon and Mars is quite difficult to do. So sometimes the physiological research isn't as robust as it could be, but that's why we have things like Bedrest studies and parabolic flights to supplement the data. And then there's varying levels of realism, sort of how much we submerge these analog astronauts into sort of the realness of being on the Moon and Mars. And then duration, we're talking days, weeks, months, even sort of up to a year or longer, and in some cases. And really, this is just a little snapshot of some of the analog missions that are going on around the world. Some of them sort of longer than others, some of them being quite long-standing. So Lunar and Green is quite a new project that's been running this year by some Danish architects, and they're doing sort of a moon analog sort of in the Arctic tundra there. But then you've got the more established high seas. So this is a NASA-sponsored Mars analog, so a bit of altitude, a bit of remoteness. And then you've got the ESA-sponsored Concordia station in Antarctica. So this has been a well-established long duration space analog for many years now. They've got year-round sort of MDs and ongoing sort of physiological and psychological research going on there, which I'm sure Nathan will be able to talk more authority on later on. And then there's other criteria for these analog missions as well. So sometimes it's the field. So this is just an example of our mission in Oman. So as well as being sort of isolated in a desert remote, there's certain factors of similar geology, so in terms of the sand, the wind speed, it's very dry, some sort of inclines. So really sort of feeding into that psychological of being submerged in sort of in that Mars environment, and that really the more that they submerge into that and they buy into it, sort of the greater sort of the validity of the scientific output, particularly from sort of the human factors research. But there's other ways that you can inflict that sense of self-reliance and isolation, and sort of NEMO is a really good example of this. So this is sort of the NASA's extreme environment marine operations, sort of based off the coast of Florida. So this is a really good way of putting these astronauts or aquanauts into a position of being in a fairly serious, dangerous situation, being self-reliant, but then also being able to practice for sort of future missions. And the reason this is so great is, as I said, they're living and working here for a couple of weeks. They're 30 meters underwater, they're isolated, they have to do all these things themselves. They do have contact with mission support, but they have to be self-reliant. But sort of as a sort of leading on to sort of Myles' part of the talk, it is quite dangerous as well. So if there's any acute medical concerns or they urgently need any sort of assistance, realistically they need a 15-hour decompression before they can return to the surface, and that's as well as all the risks of the marine life that are down there as well. So it can be pretty dangerous, but this is a well-established program that has been running for many years, and they do have lots of major incident planning in place. Most notably, they've got 24-hour sort of rapid response with a portable hyperbaric chamber and a hyperbaric chamber at their nearest sort of major trauma center as well. So they are prepared for this, but it's balancing that realism or the fidelity with the safety, because ultimately these are analog astronauts on Earth, and the reason we do this is to, yes, get good scientific data, but ultimately we want to get everyone home safely because we have the ability to do so. And then, as I mentioned, duration is another way of sort of classifying these missions, and they can last for a few days, they can last for a few weeks, and even up to months. And in the Mars Desert Research Station, so based in Utah, sort of run by the Mars Society, it's a great example of volunteers spending a few days, weeks, months on these short duration missions, going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, things like Mars 500s, almost a decade ago now, but you know, we're looking at 520 days, I believe, in the end. So it can really range in what they're trying to achieve and sort of the duration of their mission. And there are so many out there, and I feel bad I can't really do justice to all of them, and I can't list them all here, but there's a huge number of analog missions that are going on sort of internationally. Some of them are government sponsored, so NASA, ESA, and sort of Japanese and Russian space agencies sponsored, but there are also lots of really impressive smaller agency groups, not being biased, but obviously Austrian Space Forum being one of them, and there's lots of sort of volunteer and civilian sort of run groups as well that do really good work in terms of education outreach, but they also do contribute sort of to that global sort of data set as well. And this is just tipping my cap just to acknowledge that there are many analogues that are out there that help supplement the data in terms of replicating some different physiological changes of long duration spaceflight and microgravity. But again, that's a whole separate talk. But that those are out there. I'm more happy to answer questions, but it's just highlighting that analogues are great, but they do have their disadvantages as well. And this is just a short sort of example or a flavor of how one analog mission, so particularly what one we did, so Amity 18, that I was part of, and just give you an example of how one sort of analog mission, sort of their priorities and what we're trying to achieve and how we achieve sort of fidelity in our mission. So we had lots of geological surveying, equipment, communication equipment testing, and then there was a few physiological studies that we did as part of the medical team out there as well. And we did have a huge amount of, sort of public interest and sort of outreach and engagement. Part of our sort of fidelity or realism of it as well as being in the desert, remote, we had this 10-minute communication delay sort of there and back, mimicking that sort of 50 to 400 million kilometers sort of delay at any one point between Earth and Mars. And again, that was a really good way sort of to feed into that psychology of being remote, that we did have safety protocols to bypass this, but to feed into that psychology with analog astronauts that you, as well as being physically remote, so your communication was delayed as well. And then to add into that, they were in this isolated environment. We have our spacesuit simulators, the Algoda spacesuit as well, and these are quite heavy. These are about 45 kilos, and they have this restrictive exoskeleton. And if you throw into the mix, higher than expected wind speeds, humidity and temperatures anywhere sort of between 25 and 30, it's hard work. They're going on sort of these EVAs for about 4 to 6 hours, and then we're using these quad bikes as our transport systems with sort of quite rapidly changing landscape with sort of how high the wind speed was. And this led to, fortunately, only 1 or 2 sort of major instances. Unfortunately, no one was hurt. They were sort of discharged and declared fit at the scene, but it sort of just highlighted how remote and isolated we were there, and how dangerous these missions can be, and really sort of bring up to Myles will talk about sort of why sort of major incident planning and sort of having foresight of these potential issues is so important, and obviously a bit biased. That's sort of my area as well, as being one of the deputy medical officers there. So Analogue Missions, they are great. They're an excellent sort of platform for research, and sort of the greater the realism and fidelity you feed into these analogues, sort of the greater sort of scientific output and the greater data points you get from this research. But it's always a balance. I said I'm a bit biased as a medic. I want everyone to be safe and get home safely, but at the same time, being a scientist, I do want that data. So I say we can add to that sort of global sharing and try and hopefully get humans back to the sort of moon and Mars. But it's a balance. You have to really ask yourself what you're trying to achieve. What is your scientific aim? How are you going to achieve this, and what sort of level of risk are you going to accept, and how are you best going to mitigate those risks before going on these missions? And hopefully I build up nicely sort of Myles and talking a little bit about disaster risk reduction.
Brilliant, thank you, Lucas, and thank you for giving such a comprehensive overview of analogues in a very short amount of time. That's quite impressive. So I'm going to briefly talk about the combination and the interrelation between analogue missions and disaster risk reduction. But firstly, we need to define what disaster risk reduction actually is. And it's a relatively new field. Disaster risk management started around in the 1970s to the 1980s. And it's changed ever so slightly throughout that period of time. Disaster risk reduction focuses on identifying existing disaster risks and potential disaster risks, and working out how to mitigate those risks to prevent disasters from happening in the first place. And that's a change from when this field started in the 1970s and 1980s, when the focus was on being able to manage a disaster once it's already happened. But unfortunately, that there are limits to that in terms of resources, finance, and human resources. So why is this important, and how does this kind of benefit life on Earth? But it's very important because there are a huge number of people that are currently living in a remote environment. And we put a fact on the slide there that says, despite urbanization, which is predicted in the next few years and this half of the century, between 3.1 to 3.3 billion people will still be living in a remote environment on Earth. And to define a remote environment, that's talking about connectivity to other places that have more substantial resources, and limited accessibility as well. So analogues are an excellent opportunity to do research that focuses on remote environments. Not only that will benefit human exploration of the moon and ultimately Mars, but also there's direct benefits for people on Earth living in a remote environment. So the connection between the Austrian Space Forum and disaster risk reduction is what we're doing is using evaluation research combined with a critical realism synthesis approach to think about how that emergency plan and the major incident plan was put into place and how that could be improved. And that's directly going to benefit not only future analogue missions, but also disaster risk reduction policy for all of the space sector, and then linking back again to people living in remote environments. Critical realism synthesis is not commonly used method, but it's very, very useful for this type of research. Rather than doing a systematic review, which is too focused for what we want to do, and rather than doing a literature review, which is far too broad, critical realism synthesis, the emphasis is on the context. And as Lucas was very accurately describing, there are many different contexts of analogues and many different ways of managing the risks that comes with those analogues. So critical realism synthesis is a way of taking disaster risk reduction, major incident planning, emergency planning from other contexts, bringing it into one piece of literature, and then using that to evaluate the emergency plan that the Austrian Space Forum had during their 2018 Analogue mission to the Iranian desert. You go to the next slide, please, Lucas. That brings us to the end of our talk. So there's our email addresses on the slide. There's been more than happy to answer any of your questions that you didn't manage to answer today. But I think now there's some time for the audience to post some questions in the chat. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you both for that talk. That was really interesting. I've actually got a couple of questions already. So one question is, what's the best way to get involved in Analogue missions?
I think the best way to get involved is to join some of the organisations, and the Austrian Space Forum, UK Space Labs, and Space Generation Advisory Council are fantastic organisations to get involved in analogue missions. Even some organisations that don't necessarily run analogue missions, they provide an excellent network of people that may be able to point you in the right direction for a particular type of analogue that you would like to do. And again, as Lucas suggested there and described, that there are many, many different types. So talking with people and networking is a way of learning about all the different types of analogues.
And we've got a question on the chat. How expensive and time-consuming could these missions be?
Well, in terms of sort of individual cost or as an organisation?
I'm guessing like as an organisation.
It's tough. I suppose I've got some experience. Obviously, I've worked at the Austrian Space Forum. There is some funding from the Austrian Scientific Ministry, but there's a lot of, as I said, public outreach and engagement is a big part of it, and having external sponsors is a big part of it. It can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds to run these missions in terms of the logistics. But the Austrian Space Forum and other sort of volunteer organisations, they do provide a great sort of networking opportunity, and a lot of it is volunteer based. But from my experience, they very much reward hard work. Lots of people fly out to sort of Innsbruck in Austria to be part of these missions, to gain that experience, to meet others with a similar passion. So you do have to commit a certain amount of time and your own resources into it, and I've done that, and I'm sure many others like Julie and Phil have as well over the years. But as organisations, it can cost what sounds like a lot of money, sort of so tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds to get these operational, to run sort of 4 to 6 week missions. We're talking high seas, I believe, can cost sort of in the millions of dollars, but they run sort of 60 to 90 day missions. They can be quite expensive, but I suppose when you compare that to any mission, any satellite launch, any sort of ISS expedition, we're talking in the tens if not hundreds of millions when we're talking about sort of testing of hardware and the disposables and the reusables that are used for those missions. So yes, it's expensive, and they do often need sort of external sources of funding, but that's where the cost effectiveness comes in, that we can do this for a fraction of the cost of actual missions, and it means we can run a lot more of them and get a lot more data out of it as well. So for that cover, I couldn't sort of give an exact figure, but there is some cost, but it's definitely a lot cheaper than actual spaceflight missions.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you both again for the talk. We're going to move on to our next speaker. which is Dr. Julie Attia, and she's going to be speaking to us about motor unit Bedrest study. Julia's research is dedicated to human neuromuscular countermeasures evaluate resulting from microgravity. She's an associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy and an advocate for STEM pursuit in underrepresented groups. And I'm actually going to shamelessly plug the UK Space Lab's Twitter. Julia actually did a career profile for us a while ago. And on there, she gave us some really great career advice and a background in how she got into this field. So I highly suggest you head over to our Twitter and follow us, look at that career profile, and also follow Dr. Julie Attia. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Julia.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I possibly disrupted your your small speech about me, but thank you very much for giving that bio. I will just share my screen with you all. Okay, so hopefully you can see my title slide.
No, we can't see this.
I don't know why. Hang on. Okay, is that better?
Yeah, we can see that now.
Great. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Fab. Firstly, thank you all for giving up your Saturday afternoon to listen to myself and the other speakers. I'm really delighted to talk to you about this today because it's it's still very fresh, and this was a study that was done over the entirety of last year, and the AgBreezer study, which was the artificial gravity Bedrest campaign, was a very large collaboration between the European Space Agency, NASA, and the German Aerospace Centre in Cologne in Germany, and it was based there in the German Aerospace Centre all across last year. So I was very fortunate enough to be one of the teams, one of the research teams that got to go over to Cologne and prod and poke the very trusty and cooperative Bedrest participants to be able to obtain this data. And it was part of my postdoc in Manchester Metropolitan University. So this will be more of a conference style talk with kind of an introduction, methods, results and conclusions, but please feel free to ask me anything that may not make sense at the end. So I'm going to be talking to you today about motor unit properties during 2 months worth of head down bed rest with and without artificial gravity exposure during that AgBreezer study last year. So I think that one of the things that we are all familiar with is that muscle strength and actually the neuromuscular system as a whole is something that suffers quite profoundly during head down bed rest. And we've seen that muscle strength actually declines during that time. What we also know, in fact, I should probably backtrack. So although this study was done in the context of spaceflight, we can understand and appreciate that head down bed rest gives us a wealth of data and implications in a clinical sense of anyone that's really suffering from long-term disuse, such as people in intensive care. We know that also the decreases in muscle size that we see during head down bed rest, microgravity exposure, that can't fully explain the loss of strength loss that we see. So we need to try and look at other reasons or other mechanisms as to why we lose this strength. We know that muscle force is regulated by both the recruitment and the firing rate of motor units, but motor units is not something that's ever been tested during head down bed rest before. So naturally, we saw a gap here to investigate that. We used, and I'll go into this a bit more later, but we used a method called the motor unit index method to try to understand if there are any such reductions in motor units during head down bed rest. And this has been quite a well-established technique in 2 muscles in particular, the abductor digiti minimi and the tibialis anterior muscle. So we wanted to use that method on those muscles during head down bed rest. We also know that artificial gravity has been shown to enhance strength of leg muscles during a 5-day head down bed rest, but the assessment of artificial gravity during longer term bed rest had not yet been done. We also know that, well, actually, we don't necessarily know. There are, in this particular study and in that study that was done previously, they decided to use intermittent bouts of artificial gravity exposure as well as continuous, because it was thought that giving somebody a physiological stimulus in kind of segments can actually help to increase the effectiveness of that stimulus. So the 5-day study used both continuous artificial gravity exposure and fragmented exposure, and we were to do the same thing. So we wanted to understand whether a 60-day head down bed rest reduces the number and size of motor units in hand and leg muscles. And we also wanted to determine if any such degradations would be attenuated by artificial gravity, excuse me, and if so, whether there were any differences in giving that artificial gravity in bouts or in one continuous exposure. We suspected that the head down bed rest would cause reductions in the motor unit number and size in both of the muscles, and that the magnitude of the changes would be greater in the tibialis anterior, which is a leg muscle, compared to the hand muscle, because of the greater level of reduction that we see in lower leg muscles during disuse. So our design, we were very fortunate enough to have 24 participants who agreed to spend 2 months of their life in a head down bed rest situation. This was done over 2 campaigns, so 12 in one and 12 in another, all across last year, as I mentioned earlier. In total, there were 8 in the control group, so they had no treatment whatsoever, and 16 of them had 30 minutes of artificial gravity per day via human centrifugation. Half of those had it in one dose, as I mentioned before, which we have called AG1, and half had 6 lots of 5-minute bouts with 3-minute rests in the middle, and we call that one AG2. As I mentioned before, we wanted to look at motor unit number and size in the abductor digiti minimi, which is the small muscle that allows your little finger to kick out, if you like, and the tibialis anterior, which is the big muscle at the front of the lower leg, the shin, which allows you to bring your toes up towards your head. And we wanted to assess, we wanted to have a look at just prior to the bed rest so that we could establish a baseline, and we did that 5 days before. We wanted to look at any initial changes, so we did that 4 days in, that's HDT4, head down tilt 4, and we also wanted to look at the effects over a much longer period of time, so we chose day 59, which was the day before the subjects were allowed to reambulate again. So in terms of the analogue of 6-degree head down bed rest, Lucas touched on bed rest very slightly. This was everything that was done was performed in accordance with the standard guidelines, which was published by NASA, and this includes everything that you could imagine when trying to design a bed rest study. So aspects like which volunteers to recruit, how to recruit them, what we should include as our exclusion and exclusion criteria, what kind of medical screening tests should be done on these candidates before they're chosen to see if they're appropriate, and so on and so forth. If you want to have a look at that document, you can do, but it's probably a talk in itself because of the length of it. So in terms of what our participants were allowed to do and not do, they followed a day-night cycle of 6:30 a.m. wake up and 10 o'clock lights out. The entire time, the rules of the bed rest had to be followed. So every single activity was conducted in the head down position of 6 degrees, regardless of what you were doing. So anything to do with hygiene, including showering, going to the toilet, reading, etc., etc. It was actually very interesting to see how some of those activities were conducted during or whilst being in that position. Participants were allowed to change position, but they had to make sure that they had one shoulder in contact with the bed at all times. They weren't allowed to get up, they weren't allowed to sit or stand for obvious reasons, and this was all done by video surveillance, this was all monitored by video surveillance. They were allowed to do or to pursue other activities in their downtime, such as reading, playing games, but again, everything had to be done whilst in that position, and they also weren't allowed to sleep or nap, just in case that affected any of the findings from the testing. And the temperature across both campaigns was controlled at about 22.5 degrees. Regarding the centrifugation, participants were transported to the centrifuge on their bed whilst maintaining the bed rest position. They had to roll onto the centrifuge nacelle without trying to actively use their leg muscles, so that they didn't, that didn't affect any of the results. And the exposure was 1 G at the center of mass and 1.8 G at the feet. A typical centrifuge run would involve a speed of 5 degrees per second for about 32 seconds until the desired rotation was achieved. And then the same thing with regards to decelerating, the centrifuge would rotate at 5 degrees per second until it came to a complete stop. All of the monitoring, all medical monitoring was done continuously throughout each and every centrifuge run. In terms of our methods, we firstly had to put EMG electrodes on the muscles that we were interested in looking at. So the ADM again, and the tibialis anterior muscle. After we put the EMG electrodes, which you can see on the left-hand side, we then performed standard motor nerve conduction techniques to achieve the highest compound muscle action potential that we could possibly find, and that was done by supramaximal stimulation. So going over and above the maximal stimulation, whereby you see the highest compound muscle action potential, and you keep stimulating until you can see that no further increases were found. And that was done by stimulating the ulnar nerve for the ADM and the tibial nerve for the tibialis anterior. After we acquired the CMAP, we then had to obtain 20 surface interference patterns, which you can see on the far right, and that was done by getting the subjects to voluntarily contract those two muscles, obviously one at a time, in an isometric fashion. So the fingers were strapped to allow the person to try to push the little finger away from the rest of their fingers, albeit not being able to because of the strap. And the same thing with the tibialis anterior. The foot was strapped, and the aim was to try and lift the toes towards the head as hard as possible, but without actually being able to. They were asked to do that at a range of efforts, so low effort, high effort, so that we could get a range of contractions and a range of intensities, because this is the data that ultimately is used to calculate the Munichs. So the Munichs, the Munichs assessment uses a mathematical model using both the area and the power parameters from the CMAP and the SIP. So essentially we need values from this data and values from this data to essentially calculate the Munichs, which is the motor unit number. The motor unit size is then determined using dividing the CMAP via the subsequent Munichs that we calculate. So from a data perspective, it was relatively straightforward. We looked at the mean change over time. So everything was normalized to the baseline values, because we were interested to see how these values changed over time rather than the absolute figures. So we were able to compare both the head down tilt 4 and head down tilt 59 values back to the baseline 5 values. And we used time and muscle as within subject factors, group as a between subject factor. We wanted to see if there were differences whereabouts they would lie. So whether it would be at HDT4 or HDT59, our data was normally distributed and the significance was set at P being less than 0.05. I'm aware I'm running out of time. We actually don't have too much longer to go, unfortunately, which will make sense in a moment. The baseline characteristics were no different between the groups. So any parameter that you look at down the left-hand side was no different between the control, the AG1 and the AG2, meaning that we had comparable populations to compare between. And there were also no difference in the absolute values of the CMAP, Munix and MUSIX for either muscle for any or between the groups of individuals. So with regards to our compound muscle action potential, we did not see any effect of head down bed rest. The values stayed the same in each group, and there were no difference between the groups for both the hand muscle or the tibialis anterior muscle. We saw the exact same situation with regards to the Munix values. We saw no change over time in either the ADM or the TA, and no difference of artificial gravity. And then consequently the same with the MUSIX, so which is motor unit size. We saw no difference over time in either muscle and no change between the groups. So what are our conclusions? First of all, we were able to determine that the Munix and the MUSIX values fell within normal ranges for all participants at baseline, which was good. That confirms we're using a healthy cohort. People that go into space typically are of a high caliber in terms of their health, so we wanted to make sure that we could replicate that. And also, if you use people that are already detrimented, then it doesn't really give scope to assess properly whether those values will change anymore because of the plateau that they may already have. So we didn't see any change over the time of the bed rest, but we did see, when you dig deeper into the data, we did see that there was a greater effect of artificial gravity. It didn't matter which one, on Munix of the TA compared to the ADM. And this is likely related to the fact that the leg muscles obviously have more of a role in keeping us upright and being a weight-bearing muscle compared to the hand muscles. And also, they were actually using their hands muscles potentially more, being in that position because of being on the computer or reading and so on. But because we don't really know still if the participants lost muscle strength in the muscles that we looked at, we can't fully understand, or we can't fully interpret our data, because if they happen to not lose any strength in those muscles, then we wouldn't expect the motor unit properties to change anyway, which ultimately leads to probably our main limitation, that the muscles that we chose aren't really muscles that tend to be affected by microgravity exposure or head down bed rest, and that ultimately, if we were to repeat this study again, we should really look to use more anti-gravity muscles, so muscles in the calf or other extensor muscles. And that will help us in understanding over the long term if artificial gravity could be a plausible treatment for the neuromuscular system during disuse. If we can at least see a decrease or something that changes during the bed rest, then we can better understand if artificial gravity can help to offset those changes or prevent them altogether. And I think that concludes my talk. Of course, with all these things, there's always many, many acknowledgements, and because of the scale and the size of this study, there were obviously many people that without whose contribution the study for sure would not have taken place. And then there's obviously my own collaboration, which was about 5 or 6 different academic entities across Europe. So I think at that point I will stop there, and here are the references if you are curious. And also just a small shameless plug. This presentation was built off the back of our own paper, which was published a few months ago in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. So if you would like that reference also, then I'm more than happy to share it with you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to quickly a couple of questions. Christine asked, for Bedrest participants, do they also have special diets to lessen the muscle atrophy?
I didn't hear that entirely. I think you were asking if there were special diets to prevent muscle atrophy.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
So there isn't a special diet to prevent muscle atrophy, because what they would have to be aware of is that any nutritional changes that may help one thing may then subsequently affect another thing or another physiological parameter in a way that would be undesirable. So it was more that the nutrition was carefully structured and calculated so that calorie intake would mean that they didn't lose or gain weight, or at least deliberately. Excuse me. And I'm not actually entirely sure about the split of macros in terms of protein, fats, and carbohydrates, but I believe that their protein was worked out in a way that would be sufficient to maintain muscle mass, but it wasn't overly implemented into their diet for, again, obvious reasons, just in case it affected something else that shouldn't be affected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And did the participants experience any psychological challenges?
I didn't hear that properly, sorry.
Sorry, did the participants experience any psychological challenges?
Any psychological challenges?
Yeah.
So anecdotally, I can say for sure that they did. There will be papers published about that, because quite a few of the teams were looking at that aspect. But yeah, I mean, even in my own experience, seeing people on day 4 and then again on day 59, the change in their tolerance and the change in their mood was very, very, very obvious. But it will be very interesting to see what the papers actually suggest when they come out with regards to more kind of concrete parameters rather than anything anecdotal.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but thank you again for your talk.
I'm sorry. I'm more than happy to answer things later or in a different capacity.
Yeah, hopefully if we have time at the end, that'd be great, because we've got some really good questions in the chat. Thank you. So for our next talk, we have Professor Steve Harridge, who will be talking to us about spaceflight and aging. Steve has been a professor of human and applied physiology at King's College London since 2005. And he is currently director of for the Centre for Human and Applied Physiological Sciences within the Faculty of Life Sciences and Medicine. He is also co-director of Aging Research at King's and editor-in-chief of the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science and Sport. So thank you for being here today, Steve, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I trust you can hear me okay.
Yeah,
I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
And now on full screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much. Well, thank you for giving me at least 15 minutes to tackle what is actually an incredibly complex and difficult question in regard to how spaceflight and aging interact with one another. I'm going to do my best to try and tackle that and give you some sort of insights to the way we've been thinking over the last few years, more about aging than about spaceflight, but hopefully that the interaction between the two will become clear and look at some of the challenges there are in that regard. And I'd first of all just like to acknowledge my long-term collaborator and friend, Norman Lazarus. We've been working together for many years on all aspects related to aging, and some of the work that we've been doing together I'll be presenting. If we want to study aging, what do we do? Who do we study? What models do we have? There are extensive models, Drosophila, C. elegans. Also, we're going to get a talk later on from Tim Etheridge about worms in space, but we have mammalian models of aging. When we talk about aging, are we considering gerontology, geroscience, geriatrics? Are we talking about simply lifespan, or are we referring to health span? All of these questions come in, particularly when we talk about human aging. And when we look at the challenges of studying human aging and the longevity of the human lifespan, then we want models that are going to allow us to study that process. And we have models that range from studying cells in culture through to models of disease, such as progeria. But then we have also models like critical illness, particularly in terms of skeletal muscle, for example, my own interest, and also microgravity. And if I was to, no, don't check your screens, that is a slide, because that's meant to indicate how much we know about healthy human aging. And I'm going to be cruel, but I'm actually going to put a little star there. Say, well, that maybe we know something, but not a huge amount in regard to healthy human aging. So when we try and link that into spaceflight, what are the interactions between aging and particularly the microgravity environment? These are the challenges and the interesting questions that we have. There are essentially two problems. Is that we don't actually understand the true long-term effects of microgravity in humans. We're not going to be able to do that because we know that the effects are essentially very negative, and ethically we're just not going to be able to put astronauts into space for 6 months or so without any kind of countermeasure. So we actually don't know the long-term effects of microgravity per se. But likewise, we also have problems in understanding human aging, because in many situations we've not used appropriate models to allow us to study the inherent biology of aging, predominantly because we have aging models which integrate and conflate disease and disuse related processes with aging. So you've got two pictures there. One, a very sedentary individual who you may recognize from the royal family, another's a master athlete. These reflect the two ends of the spectrum of activity of human behavior in the Western world, in that sense. And what can we learn from aging from the inactive individual or from the active individual? And our hypothesis has been that we can only really understand the biology of aging if we study very active people, because we have evolved, the human species has evolved on the basis of having high levels of physical activity from our hunter-gatherer heritage. And people often ask me about aging and say, well, does exercise, being physically active, reverse the aging process? And of course, it doesn't reverse the aging process at all. The aging process is there and it's inherent in all of us. And even those who are the most physically active and the most highly trained throughout their lives, such as master athletes, we see this progressive decline in performance, as indicated here by the world record performances for 100 meters and 10,000 meters on the track. So we're not preventing aging, but what we're looking at here are people who are optimally aging. So to try and put that into some more theoretical context, Norman and I published this idea of there being a set point theory for aging, a bit of an extrapolation of various set points we have in physiology. But the concept being that if you are here in this so-called gold zone, then you're doing lots of physical activity, lots of training. You're not going to be influenced by disuse associated processes. So you're going to be optimally aging and you're going to have compressed morbidity at the end of life. But most people aren't there. What if you do sufficient amounts of exercise? Well, this puts you into the green zone. So you're now at the set point or the set zone. You're doing sufficient activity. You're going to optimize your health span and you're going to have optimal aging and compressed morbidity in later life. But of course, many older people are not in either of those two zones. They're in this red zone. We're doing insufficient activity. The health span is compromised, and now we've got an uncertain health trajectory, non-optimal aging, and extended morbidity. So how does this link back to space? Well, let's take John Glenn as a fantastic example of actually a healthy ager. And this actually raises some interesting points. So John Glenn first went into space in 1962, the first American to orbit the Earth when he was aged 42. But years later, as part of a shuttle program, he went and spent 8 days in space, age 77. Of course, there was lots of discussion at the time. How can someone of that age be allowed to go into space or yet withstand the remarkable physiological challenges that we have of being in space. So here we've got an interesting situation, because he was probably an optimal ager. He was allowed to go in space primarily because of the remarkable physiological condition that he was in. He was a really fit, healthy, older individual. So when we put someone like him into space, are we studying aging? Well, not really. What we're doing here is studying someone who has healthily aged, and then you put them in the challenging environment of space and see what happens. That's not the same as studying aging processes per se. But we know that the microgravity system is very challenging. It's affecting multiple systems. I'll touch upon a couple of these, but skeletal muscle is my own particular bias. We're going to focus on that. But all of these changes, when we have declines in cardiovascular, respiratory function, vestibular function, in bone, the immune system, skeletal muscle, they all sound a little bit like getting older. So it's obvious to make this link between microgravity and aging. But are the processes the same? This is the big question. So we take skeletal muscle, and here's a force velocity curve, which those that have done their MSCs at King's will know and love, show a decline in muscle mass and function. So we get reduced force, reduced power out, but relating largely to a loss of muscle mass and muscle atrophy. But we get a similar thing. We change that slide and simply change the picture from an astronaut to an older person. We get a decline in strength and power, but are the two underlying processes the same? If we just briefly look at the older muscle, we can see that in this instance, we see an older lady who's got a decline. This is actually not her muscle, but it's MRIs taken from the mid-thigh of a healthy younger woman and a healthy old woman. But you can see, even though this woman is healthy, she's sedentary, and we've got an infiltration of fats and connective tissue. We've got a decrease in muscle quality as well as a decline in muscle mass. And there are three kind of characteristics that we can associate with this older or sarcopenic muscle. That is an infiltration of fat and connective tissue, as I've just described, an atrophy of the fast contracting type 2 fibers, and Julia has just been talking about loss of motor units, which is a key aspect of getting older. So we lose motor units and we lose muscle fibers, and there's a remodeling of that process. But when we look at very active individuals, and these are just some examples of muscle biopsy samples that we took from a group of master cyclists whom we studied a few years ago, and we saw absolutely no deterioration in the quality of the muscle. We saw no type 2 fiber atrophy. And what we're looking at here, we took these to a histopathologist. He'd say, well, there's no difference in the quality of these muscles from that of a young individual. So we're maintaining this muscle quality, and indeed a high level of muscle function in these individuals, even though they're getting older. So when we talk about infiltration of fat, infiltration of connective tissue, decline in muscle mass, rapid declines in function, how much of that can be attributed to aging? How much of that is attributed to an interaction between aging and inactivity? And this is just an example of one of our master cyclists showing an MRI scan, and that's a beautiful MRI image showing a perfectly healthy, normal muscle. That again could be looking at a young individual's muscle. Much of the loss in muscle as we get older has been attributed to issues relating to inflammation. What I'm showing you here are two markers of inflammation, IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And this was a study involving our master cyclists and a group from the University of Birmingham, headed up by Janet Lord. And what you can see here is the phenomenon I've just been describing, that as we age, we have a low level of chronic inflammation, as evidenced by these elevated levels of IL-6 and TNF-alpha compared to healthy young. And here we see the healthy old. But when we look at our master cyclists by comparison, we can see that they really are not inflamed, and certainly not to the same extent. There's a marked amelioration of this. So when we're talking about inflammaging, we could actually be talking about inactivity. So it's again teasing out aging from inactivity processes. So what happens to muscle in microgravity? Well, we know that muscle strength and power decline. We know that muscle fibers atrophy. We know that fibers become more glycolytic and less oxidative. And we know that postural muscles are affected most. And this is a really nice review by Narici and de Boer from 2011, showing unloading duration plotted against decreases in muscle size using a variety of different models. And you can see, you can get a sense here of the variability that occurs. Although the trend is down, you can see that there's quite a heterogeneity of response between individuals. And of course, when we get out to 180 days, then we're also looking at the effects of countermeasures which are compromising the effects of the unloading or the microgravity. And what I've put here is a red dot, which is the kind of loss that we see in the quadriceps muscle, 20% loss in quadriceps muscle cross-sectional area after just 10 days of unloading in the critical care situation. But now we're in a completely different situation. So here's two accelerated aging models. I mentioned critical illness at the beginning as well. These are studies that we've been doing in collaboration with Julie Attia, Nick Hart, Hugh Montgomery, etc., characterizing the muscle loss that's occurring in patients who are in intensive care units. And we see a rapid deterioration in that muscle. If you're in multi-organ failure, as I've just mentioned, you can get a 20% loss in the rectus femoris cross-sectional area. In parallel studies with looking at unloading, this is using the hyperbuoyancy flotation tank developed by Dave Green that Phil Carvil used for his spinal unloading studies. And in this particular series of experiments, this is part of Tess Morris-Patterson's PhD, we did whole body MRI scans on individuals pre and post 7 days of this unloading, and basically showed across the whole body there was about a 1 kilo on average loss of muscle mass as a result of that unloading period. So this microgravity analog, there's lots more data that's going to come from that study. But here you've got two instances where you've got a disease model, and here you've got a very healthy model where you've got an imposition of unloading. But what do these two models do in regard to understanding aging muscle? If we go back to the concept I raised at the beginning, which is, do we really understand aging if we study inactivity and disease processes? So coming back to that idea, very briefly, if we take these individuals that we studied previously, I've mentioned these were these amateur road cyclists that we studied at between 55 and 79 years of age. This is their VO2 max data, and you can see in the females and in the males we get a decline as a result of age. That's fine. What's new about that? You could argue there's nothing new about that, only in the sense that in these really targeted individuals who've maintained high levels of physical activity, we can't ascribe that decline to a change in activity. That is an aging reduction. And if we normalize it to body mass, as we would do, males and females come closer together. But what I want to do in this particular slide is put another slope in, which is from a meta-analysis of VO2 max data from sedentary males. So you can see these highly active individuals are up and to the right of the sedentary individuals. So in this sense, we take an 80-year-old cyclist and see where they hit the sedentary curve. That's a 35-year functional advantage. But what I want to do is just turn that story around, because that is the traditional story that we tend to associate when studying with physically active older people. But we would say, actually, this should be viewed the other way around. It is the young people who are not where they should be. The cyclists are where they should be because they are in the green zone, they're doing sufficient exercise to age optimally. They shouldn't have this advantage. It is the young individuals who are 35 years below. So they are accelerating their aging processes, whereas these individuals are where they should be because they're doing sufficient activity, as I mentioned, as regards to the green zone. And we can extrapolate this from beyond exercise and cardiorespiratory function, from skeletal muscle to the immune system. This has great relevance at the moment, of course, in regard to COVID. This is led by Janet Law, this paper collaboration with our cyclists and the University of Birmingham's cohorts, and basically showed that when we look at the immune system, and this example of the percentage of T cells here, we can see that in their cohort we would expect the decline, as has previously been reported, between young and old. But when we see our master cyclist data, there is no decline as a result of a young versus older comparison. In fact, both groups are similar and both are different from the healthy old. And we could extend that study. There was multiple indices that were measured there. But the basic message was you're getting a real amelioration of immunosenescence by being physically active. So again, what are the lessons for spaceflight in a model where we know that there's a decline in immune function? So this kind of message is out there in different forms. You know, Joan Vernikos's great book says it all, but we can apply that to aging. Is that sitting is accelerating your aging. Moving is allowing you to age optimally. And we go back to Dame Sally Davies, who dodged a bullet by stepping down as chief medical officer before COVID came along. But if physical activity were a drug, we're talking about it as a miracle cure. So the kind of message about we must be physically active has been around. So when we talk about the links between space and aging, the commonality in terms of the countermeasure relates to physical activity and exercise. So the countermeasures for space, and you'll be familiar with the countermeasures that are going on in the International Space Station with both aerobic, running, cycling, but also, I won't say weight training because of course it's resistance exercise, are similar in terms of how we would view countermeasures for sarcopenia. In other words, high resistance training is the most effective treatment for aging related processes in regard to muscle loss. So we could go through this very detailed scheme of what happens to muscle in spaceflight, what happens to muscle in sedentary aging, what happens to muscle in healthy active aging. We can see that actually the processes are really quite different, and Julie has just been giving a very nice talk about motor unit or fiber number here. In spaceflight, and she supported data, we're not looking at changes in fiber number, so that's not the same as we see as a result of aging, sedentary aging, or indeed of active aging. So we are seeing some commonalities, but an awful lot of differences between these three groups, which relate to spaceflight, which relate to inactive aging, and which differ from healthy active aging. So I'm conscious of time, so thank you for bearing with me. For some closing thoughts, aging itself is not a disease. We must be really careful in using the terminology as regards what we mean by aging research and interpreting the models that we use. ISS is a fantastic laboratory, of course, and I would say we learn a lot about human biology in terms of particularly muscle type issues. We're relating and understanding more about frailty than we are about healthy aging. And a significant proportion of what we see in the vast majority of older people is an interaction of aging with disuse related processes. It's not solely an aging phenomena, because so many people are doing insufficient levels of activity that we're in superimposing disuse phenomena. But basically the countermeasures for microgravity challenges are the same as they are for during the life course on Earth, and that is basically maintain as much physical activity as you can. So with that, and I'm conscious of over time, so I'm not going to list all of those that have been collaborating on the various projects and some of the data I've presented, but just leave the slide there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that talk. We've got time for one quick question. So I've got a question here that asks, which muscles decondition the most for astronauts, and which ones decondition the most for those who are not as active as they get older?
Okay, that's a really good question, and the answer is pretty much the same. So the postural muscles are the ones that are most affected by unloading and spaceflight. So that is the working your way up from the calf muscles to the quadriceps. We found that in our unloading model, that the data I very quickly showed. We found exactly that. The largest muscle loss was in the calf and in the thigh, and we tend to see that in aging as well, but it's the lower leg muscles or the lower limb muscles that are most affected.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just going to squeeze this other question really quickly. Do the master cyclists mount an inflammatory response when challenged with allergens?
Good. We haven't actually studied that, but we know that very physically active people are likely to have a better immune response to a vaccination. And there's data showing that undertaking exercise programs before receiving vaccinations, we're not talking about the COVID vaccination, but flu vaccinations, for example, get a better response from those that are inactive.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for answering those questions and thank you for your talk. We're going to take a quick 2-minute break before we move on to the reference paper by UK Space Labs. So yeah, please bear with us and just take a 2-minute break and we'll be back very soon. Okay, so we're going to start the program again after that very short break. So thank you for staying with us so far. I'd now like to introduce our UK Space Labs coordinator, Dr. Phil Carvil, to lead the segment. Phil has a PhD in space physiology from King's College London, where he is also a visiting lecturer. And the focus of his PhD was on evaluating astronaut countermeasure, which has since flown on the ISS twice. He currently works for the Science and Technology Facilities Council, part of the UK Research and Innovation, and is also the current Vice President of the European Low Gravity Research Association. So today he will be joined by several of his esteemed colleagues to discuss the key reference paper entitled Why Space? The Opportunity for Health and Life Science Innovation, which is a project coordinated by UK Space Labs. So thank you for joining us today, Phil, and thank you to your key contributors who are joining us as well. I'll hand over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for your time today, and also thank you to the speakers who have come before as well. So we've heard some fantastic contributions today, really from that spectrum in terms of health and life sciences. And that's really what today's conversation I'm going to have with you now is about. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just outlining a little bit about why the papers come about, how the process we've gone in terms of integrating the paper and sharing, collating the ideas, and also how you yourselves can learn more and also get involved. Firstly, just share that image there, the cup of coffee going. One thing I should probably say about my background as well, while I'm passionate about space, I'm also passionate about coffee as well. Probably owing to the fact that during my bachelor's and master's, I worked for Starbucks for many years. So coffee is very much integral to both my function, but also I think paramount as well in terms of how we sort of build relationships and share ideas. So I invite you now to a cup of coffee, and I'll share some ideas now, but also some thoughts on the paper that is being developed on why space, the opportunity to help in life science innovation. So let me start these slides work. Brilliant. So when we're looking at the paper and developing it, there were a couple of things which were key to develop here. So one was thinking about why we do the paper in the first place. Second as to how, and then third as to when. So when was an appropriate time to do the paper, but also in terms of how to go about it there. Oh, sorry, seems having a few flickering issues there. So bear with me one moment and I'll just go through that again. If not, then I'll just talk without the slides. There we are. Okay, so the opportunity first. This is quite a critical part of the paper. So when you talk to different people as to why you would utilize space or do research in space, you can get different answers. Those who are very passionate or they have a lot of previous experience in working in space, and those who may not understand what platforms are available or may not have the opportunity yet to actually utilize those platforms. So one incredible point in this paper was to really think about how we could go about an exercise which could talk about and articulate the benefits of engaging more with the space sector, but also across that spectrum of the health and life sciences, support both research, but also innovation, development, and implementation. So that was incredibly important there. So if you think about health and life sciences for a moment, what comes under that? We're talking about topics which cover from AI and data, all the way to agriculture, to ethics, to psychiatry, psychology and psychiatry, from social science to regenerative medicine. So a huge spectrum there of experts to really engage and sort of ask that question as to how we could benefit more from interacting with the space sector. So that was the opportunity with this paper. As I said, when we're looking there about the engagement side, again, looking at spectrum, who is already working in this in space is important. So in terms of interacting with the engaged community. So a lot of the UK Space Labs community is very engaged in space or knows a lot of colleagues who are already doing research in or utilizing that domain. But it's incredibly important to also diversify the thoughts on the opportunity and hear from those who haven't engaged yet with the space sector. And so the other thing there is taking those thoughts of what has been done and what's happening currently, how can we look forward? How can we look forward as to what space research might look like in a couple of years' time, but also what that tells us about potential benefits terrestrially as well. Why would we continue to invest and do more with space or with microgravity or in hypergravity environments? And how can we articulate that collective benefits to help shape future research and innovation pathways, in particular, the policy and funding behind research. So, and this really goes to a really fantastic quote there. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking in terms of what's created them. So really where we look about here is what is the opportunity to use space to think and co-create solutions in a different way. So how have we done this so far? So I'll give a very brief overview of what we've been doing so far. So firstly, workshops over the last couple of years, building the community, so being hosted both in person, so quite a few of these have been hosted at the Harville Science Innovation Campus in Oxfordshire, but also virtually as well. So the team at UK Space Labs and also SGAC has done a numerous sort of workshops, building up the community and getting the message out there in terms of how people can learn more about space. So using these engagement and community sites, we've done surveys to get an idea of the key topics, assess the interest, and also develop more contacts. This has led to interviews, which we've conducted as well. So multiple interviews, people to really understand the in-depth feedback from their sector. Where did they see the benefit from it? And also how would they like to feed into it? And the last bit about feeding in goes into sort of the paper itself. So developing this key position paper. And what we've done there is have a call for key author contributions and inputs into the paper. And this will go into what speakers will be talking about in a moment. So in terms of the when, so what are the timelines here? So the call for author contributions, we launched that this year at the end of August and opened it to the end of September there. So roughly about 5 weeks for experts from across the different sectors to put in their contributions. We received over 30 contributions in that first wave from a multiple number of sectors, but also people who haven't engaged with space before, articulating their case experience of working terrestrially, and then discussing what this benefit could be from interacting more with the space sector in general. And we'll hear some talks from some of those colleagues here today on the panel, on these next sort of panel contributions. During this process, it was incredibly important we had both a structured way to both review the abstracts that we were getting in from different experts, have a way to standardize these, but also have this overseen by an independent board. So it can be an independent board of research funders, UK Space Associates, and also academics as well, to review the process that was being undertaken. So for an example, each contribution had 2 reviewers for each one to look at the fit for the paper and give any feedback to the author. So that process is currently underway at the moment, giving that feedback. And that same process will go into our next phase, which I'm just going to talk about briefly today, is a second call for author contributions that will be launching in December and closing at the end of January. And that will be incredibly important. So again, taking that process you see above there and applying it to the second call, because that will all feature into the drafting process, which will be winter and spring in 2021, looking after spring for a publication of the paper. So just to finalize here, what do we mean when we're talking about asking people for author contributions? And again, the key here is it's a co-creation of the paper, asking for all those diverse opinions and then collating and editing that together into a cohesive narrative. And so we've asked all the contributors to think about 3 key things. Firstly, an overview. Give us an overview of your sector. Tell us why it's important in the health and life science sector. What is the case experience you have as well here in terms of either doing your research terrestrially, but also potentially if you've also done space or gravity related experiments as well. And then that third thing, really thinking about what could be the potential impact and terrestrial benefit to drive new research and innovation through doing more work interacting with the space sector, either through using microgravity or hypergravity platforms, or even looking at some of the authors is talking about today already, looking at that discovery side as well, that exploratory element, about how we look at future sort of human exploration. So as I mentioned already, the second call for contributions will be launching in December, and this will be accompanied by a template. So if you would like to hear more, please do get in contact with the UK Space Labs team. Also get in contact with myself as well. My details are in the biography booklet that the team has put there together. But what I will do now, I'll just stop sharing my slides and then I'll go on to hand over to our number of speakers. So I'm delighted to be joined by 6 colleagues today. And our first colleague is Professor Kate Robson-Brown. Kate is a professor at the University of Bristol and also the chair of UK Space Labs. Oh, sorry, I'm still sharing my slides. Apologies about that. Sorry, let me restart there, Kate, to give you the proper introduction before you start.
That's
So
okay.
Kate is Professor of Biological Anthropology and Mechanical Engineering at the University of Bristol, a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and AI, and she's also the director of the Gene Golding Institute for Data Science and Data Intensive Research, a lay chair for Health Education Southwest, and also the chair of Bristol Synthetic Biology. So Kate, it's an enormous pleasure to have you today here to talk about your research and your contributions and where you see the potential for utilizing more space with data and digital in space life and biomedical sciences. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm just working out how to share my screen. Is that working? No. Hang on. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, we can hear you just fine, not a problem. So if you just want to take a moment to try and get the slides.
I think I'm nearly there. Is that working?
Not yet,
No.
Kate.
No, it just tells me I haven't got permissions. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time. I will just speak over them if you can cope with that. So yeah, thanks Phil very much for the introduction. It really has been a huge pleasure to take on the role of chair of UK Space Labs, and I think the past 10 months has been an enormous roller coaster for everybody, full of enormous challenges. And for me, it's been one of the great pleasures of this period that despite all that, we've managed to take some huge step forwards, both in the position paper, but also in developing the community. And I take my hat off to all of you involved in today's event, but also the other events that have happened while we've been in lockdown. I think it's felt from the outside in pretty seamless, I think, and it's been, hugely important to the sector. And the second thing I wanted to say, so I'm here speaking about digital and data in space life and biomedical sciences, but partly because that's my where I come from, in the sense of my comfort zone, and where I think I can provide most value for the developing of the position paper. But I just wanted to say quite briefly why I think it's really important that we're having this engagement now through the position paper. So I've been knocking around in this field for 20 years or so, and I think I can honestly say I've never felt that there have been more opportunities and energy around the space sector generally than what we see today. We have a UK R&D roadmap which has placed the space sector very high on the national agenda. We have the recently created National Space Council for the first time, which is essentially a subcommittee of the Cabinet Office, which is developing their own national space strategy. And some of you on the call today may be involved in providing expert witness for that. We have just this week the announced Space Command and the AI agency, which is going to be attached to that. There was the launch of the first space engineering technician apprenticeships in England from the start of next year, and the aspiration that might create 30,000 jobs in the sector. UK Space Agency has just announced its 7 new regional space hubs that it's funding with support from STFC, and the aim of those initiatives is to give some regional consortia opportunity to position themselves at the forefront of space-enabled innovation and inclusive growth. So loads of opportunity there. The UKRI has undertaken their own internal space review process for research and are developing a strategy which I hope will turn into funding, although the CSR, the spending review results may not have gone the way that they were hoping, but we shall see. And then, of course, I hesitate to say that we might be moving towards a post-COVID-19 landscape. I hope we are. But there are going to be many strategies for regional economic growth and the terminology of levelling up coming on the horizon, I suspect, over the next 12 months. And then you really got to look, if you think internationally, we've got Artemis, the new Accords and the Outer Space Treaty and all the opportunities that arise through that. There's the announcement this week of some of the successes around the Chang'e mission and lunar exploration from China. There's the development of the ESA roadmaps for all kinds of research work streams from 2024 to 2030. I'm involved in the biology one and the lunar biomission one, and I'm sure there are other people on this call who are involved just the same. So huge energy around that at the moment. And from my perspective, the very interesting and long overdue movement towards developing an ESA data center, which I gather is going to be in Madrid, to house and curate data produced by ESA-funded projects. And then, of course, we can't forget at the moment the impact of Brexit, which will provide some funding for initiatives from the centre, I think, and also provide us some challenges as we negotiate our relationship with our European partners, whether within the ESA family or not. So when we're thinking specifically about data science and data intensive research and digital around this, I think we have to remember that the terminology of data science is very new. It's only really been knocking around for the last 15 or 20 years. And it's generally agreed, I think it's safe to say, that data science is really a process rather than a discipline. So it's a process of collaboration between foundational subjects like computer science, mathematics, statistics, and digital technology. And in the intersections between those are specific opportunities around, for example, machine learning or software engineering or technologies around connectivity. It's not a single discipline. It involves all data science involves a multidisciplinary team of complementary skills. And what we're looking for in this position paper are contributions from people working in those foundational areas who have a focus and an interest in an application in the life sciences as they relate to space. Another way of articulating that would be to think about data science in terms of a life cycle, beginning with data capture. So if there are any of you out there who are interested in data acquisition and data entry, and we've seen the talks just today that show some really interesting and innovative work, for example, around the use of medical imaging for that, and the image processing and analytics that goes along with that would be a really good example, I think, of where we can make a contribution in this field. And then there's, moving around the cycle, we might think about data maintenance. This is warehousing, data lakes, data cleaning and staging, triaging, and data architectures. So if anybody out there is interested in the ethics of data storage, for example, biometrics and how we deal with that within the data science community, or if you're interested in data sharing, so bringing together data sets from disparate sources. So, for example, mechanical testing in the lab and genomics, then those solutions around that are the kinds of things that we'd be interested in hearing from you about. And then you can move around to thinking about processing and analysis. So I've already seen today some examples of some really lovely, quite sophisticated data analytics and visualization projects. So if you're interested in exploratory data analytics or predictive modeling, network analysis, artificial intelligence, and even moving forward from that to thinking about data visualization and realization, where do you think AR and VR might be able to play a role in all this? Both in terms of human performance, training and assessment, but also in terms of design of systems. So any of those kinds of areas we would, I think, could be included in this part of the white paper, our position paper. So what I'd like to have in this section is a kind of a core where we're thinking about theoretical foundations, the foundational research methodologies that we use in data science and using digital technology to underpin the work that we do in space, life and biomedical sciences, but with maybe some different applications branching out from that. And we've seen some really nice examples of that, but give some examples of where predictive modeling is really useful, or some examples of where data sharing and ingress of data from different routes could be important, or where standards, methodologies and interoperability become key. Because I think we really do have a role to play as a community in defining some of these methodologies and setting the agenda on the national stage. So I think that I will stop there. If I had my slides, I was going to show you a couple of the examples of projects that I've been involved in, one around radiation dosimetry and the other around modeling, creating digital twins of the spine, in my case from an animal model involving zebrafish. But maybe I can keep that for another time. But the kind of take home message is that we would really like some contributions in this space. please do. You can always drop me a line to contact me about this. I will be helping to collate the submissions we have for this section, but I would really like to hear from you, whatever level you think you're working at, if you see what I mean, whether you're in the foundational methodologies or very much the application ends. I think we have a really strong narrative to sell, and it really needs to be integral to our position paper. So I will Phil, do you want me to hand straight over to Hagen, or back to you?
Just back to me for a moment, Kate. So just because there's one question already. Kate, could you comment on this? Does the UK have an equivalent of NASA's Gene Lab?
No, and actually I think, well, not as such, not specifically for space-related research. There are other international data, open data resources for genetics, but I think that it's something we could certainly recommend as part of improvement of data infrastructure. It seems to me that one of the things that is holding us back as a community, and I don't actually in this case just mean the life science community, but a space research community generally, is not having the infrastructure and expertise on a national level to facilitate this kind of data sharing and secondary data analysis. And I do think that's something that we could call for.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for your contributions there. We might have time at the end to look at those wonderful slides you mentioned.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find a way of showing.
Thank you very much. Well, it's my pleasure to hand over to our next speaker, Professor Hagen Bailey. Hagen is Professor of Chemical Biology at the University of Oxford. A major interest in his laboratory is the development of engineered protein nanopores for stochastic detection, including single molecule covalent chemistry and ultra-rapid biopolymer sequencing. Recently, the Bailey Lab has developed techniques for the fabrication of 3D tissues, both living and synthetic, and in 2005, Professor Bailey founded Oxford Nanopore, which has manufactured the portable mini-iron and other DNA, RNA sequences. So Hagen, absolute pleasure to have you here today, and you'll be discussing 3D printing of living tissues. Over to you. Thank you. Brilliant, Hagen. We'll come back to you in a moment and look forward to hearing your presentation, in which case we will come back to you after our next speaker and check that one. So Matthew, I'm just going to cue you up, please. So we're going to hand over to our next speaker and then come back to Hagen. So Dr. Matthew Dickinson is a senior lecturer in mechatronics engineering at the University of Central Lancashire and an active member of the MedTech Solutions Group led by Professor Richards. After achieving his PhD in the field of tribology, he was able to publish research and proceedings in the same field. Using the extensive expertise and experience in computer-aided design provided by his PhD, Dr. Dickinson's work has now shifted towards smart assisted technologies such as exoskeleton design. And so Matthew will be discussing today hybrid assisted technologies for improved sustainability of health. So Matthew, over to you, please.
Thank you, Phil. Just to double check, you can hear me, can't you?
You can indeed, just fine.
Right, brilliant. I'll just share my screen. 2 seconds, everyone. Right, so thank you for inviting me to the event. It's been absolutely fascinating so far. So, as Phil said, I'm Dr. Matt Dickinson. I work at the University of Central Lancashire. My background is I am a mechatronics engineer, and I was just going to give you a short and very brief introduction to assistive technologies, more interestingly, hybrid assistive technologies for an improved sustainability of health. A long title, I do agree, but right, so why space? Now, I pulled this directly from NASA's website, and NASA puts an information pack out each year, and under it they quote that studies have shown that astronauts have experienced 20% loss of muscle mass in between 5 and 11 days. This is if they don't exercise. Now, this has always fascinated me. The idea of this has always been a fascinating topic. So one possible way of addressing these types of things, and it's really nice, some of the former talks, because that obviously really elaborates to this further, is the use of exoskeleton technology. Now, just to give you an overview of an exoskeleton system, first initially introduced in 1890, shockingly in 1890 by Nicholas Jorgen. And this really doesn't fall under the classification of an exoskeleton. It falls under the classification of exosuit. Now, these two are clearly differently because the exoskeleton offers skeletal muscular mimicry, and the exosuit offers skeletal muscular mimicry, and the exoskeleton tries to mimic the passive behavior but is motorized. Not until we move down the line do we actually hit in the mid 70s, well, the mid 60s to 70s, where the Hardy man was first introduced. This would be the world's first actual motorized exoskeleton system, really designed around the shop worker and the shop floor. A not very good successful design, ran for about 10 minutes, was always plugged in, and could only lift around, I think it was only about 30 kilos it could lift. So not a good application. However, really started to spell out the idea, captured a lot of people's imaginations. But when we move towards the 2000 era, technology becomes smaller, motors become smaller, this becomes more accessible. And what this begins to do is interest scientists, engineers about the use of these systems to actually support military for holding large weights, or actually introducing skeletal systems like the hybrid assisted limb, which Japanese design, and designed more around not enhancement, but more support and more assistive technologies. Around this time, we see the E-legs emerge. Now, the E-legs, this is a very famous design. A lot of people have seen people who sadly suffer who are paraplegic, and they'll wear one of these suits, and it will essentially mimic that walking motion. At the same time, places like Lockheed Martin start to invest a lot of money into the exosuit, which again is the muscular mimicry process. Around this, not until we hit around 2 years ago do we really see the very first type of technology that starts to look at the all-important trunk, the spine, looking at the actual support. Now, this system came out of the University of Michigan. Granted, it's a development design, but it captured and it indicated a key thing about being able to control the spine and almost hold the spine in its own right, hold itself into a position. Now, this really captured where we were wanting to go. So, basing this, looking at this, we decided to look at the use of 3D printing. Now, this is based on the rose itself. This is a 3D printed exoskeleton system. This uses polylactic acid for the skeletal structures. It uses PET, a thermoplastic PET for interface for the motors. Now, through extensive amounts of research, we've hit it and we've run it to make sure that this could actually support the body in motion. Amazingly, I should point out, when we first suggested this as a system, this was designed for children, and the idea is that it's maintainable, it's easily changed, components are easily changed. We ran as many different tests as we could. Into our second set of tests, we realized one major thing. We realized that it wouldn't be as comfortable as what we wanted it to be. We realized that it could help the body move, and we actually do have a second system. Now, the reason I titled the topic for the presentation was hybrid systems is we've realized that we've gone about this totally wrong. We should be looking at the exosuit and the exoskeleton as a joint system. This then spun out of control in his minds. This got super excited because it made us realize that these types of systems don't have to be assistive, they can also be restrictive. So in other words, if you're in an environment where gravity is low and you need to train muscles, you restrict the moments of motion of that body. What you could perhaps do is offer almost, you've got to pardon me with this term, but a mobile gym. You would be wearing a system that could tune itself. Now, further to this, we've been looking at the use of linear discriminant analysis. We want to try and break different terms down from electromyography signals. I should point out this is very, very early days from where we've been looking. But what we think this could do, and what we think this could offer for space, is if you have a system that needs to respond under zero gravity, when it moves into a gravity condition which isn't, and it's a gravity of Mars or gravity of Earth, it can adjust itself to actually assist the muscles in an assistive regime or a non-assistive or a resistive regime. Again, I know I'm almost at time, so let me just say thank you for listening, everyone. They're my contact details if anybody's fascinated with this topic even more. I'm sorry I couldn't actually present the latest design that we have. It's just on the verge and almost ready to be shown off, but it's just not ready to be seen yet. So thank you. I'll pass you back to Phil.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matthew. There, a fantastic presentation there. I think there was some points there from Martin in the chat there about the sprint study which ISS published recently. So I think there's a suggested link to you to follow up there with Martin, definitely Matthew, and we would certainly look forward to your findings being presented later. We're going to move backwards back on the presentation now and move to Hagen. Fantastic, but over to you, please.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we've been doing in 3D printing tissues, including living tissues. If I could have the next slide. So our group is in a department of chemistry, but we're really a very multidisciplinary research group. We also have biologists and physicists in our group. And our main interest really in the basic sciences is looking at membrane proteins. But in terms of biotechnology, we've been applying these membrane proteins in various areas. And one that Phil mentioned was in the area of sensing and nucleic acid sequencing. And we've also been able to use engineered membrane pores for looking at single molecule chemistry and also for as components of tissues that I'll tell you about in a moment. So just in way of a little bit of history on the next slide, the MinION sequencer that was developed by my company, Oxford Nanopore, has actually been used in space on the ISS, as well as even in even less amenable environments such as the Arctic. So we would hope that in the end our synthetic tissues and printed living tissues can be used in the same way. Next slide, please. So again, as I said, we're going to focus on designer tissues. And there are really three areas here. So one is completely synthetic tissues that are just built from parts. And these are non-replicating, non-living materials that I'll tell you about in a moment. We can use a similar technology to 3D print living cells with high viability at high density. And we could also make hybrids of these structures. So first of all, the synthetic tissues. Next slide, and next slide again, because that doesn't say very much. In making synthetic tissues, what we've been able to do is 3D print small aqueous droplets, and these droplets can communicate with each other through engineered protein pores, and we can also add other functional components to these droplets, enzymes, transporters, and so on. And the basic idea is shown on the next slide. So we take tiny aqueous droplets, either nanoliter or picoliter droplets. We put them into an oil that contains an amphipathic molecule like a lipid. They become surrounded by a monolayer. And when you bring two of these together, they will form a lipid bilayer between them. Two cells would normally be separated by two lipid bilayers, but in this case, they're just connected by one lipid bilayer that turns out to be very useful. So initially we use these, as shown on the next slide, to build very small little networks of these droplets. So this is one that's two-dimensional, just 4 droplets, and by using an engineered protein pore that only conducts ions at 1 potential, we can actually build a little electronic circuit that acts as a full wave rectifier. So obviously individual droplets can't do this, so this is really a kind of emergent property that you get by building these structures from the individual droplets. So on the next slide, so having done that, we thought we could make more complex structures and larger structures, and we did that by 3D printing. So we devised a 3D printer that could print picoliter droplets. These are 50 picoliters in this particular picture, and in that way you can build up millimeter and centimeter size structures from these droplets. And of course you can use different types of droplets in the printed structure, and that allows you to pattern these so-called synthetic tissues, as shown on the next slide. So here just a few examples, but if we look at the central one, this is printed from 20 layers, and it shows the blue cells as an arborizing network that you might find in the nervous system or the vascular system. So the next slide just shows that we can build different functional properties into these synthetic tissues. We can get them to fold, we can get them to make proteins and so on, but in this particular example, we've made this tissue from 2 types of droplets, either droplets that just contain buffer solution, or the green droplets contain protein pores. And by putting 2 electrodes on this structure, I can't use my mouse here, but the 2 big green blobs on the top right structure are electrodes. So, and we can conduct ions quickly and rapidly, quickly and directionally through the pathway that's shown. So in that way, these act really by mimicking neurons, and we can mimic other aspects of living tissues using these synthetic tissues. But if we go to the next slide, and again, we can just whiz by to this one, we can use the same kind of technology to print living cells. And again, we can print droplets that are of picoliter volumes that contain living cells of various sorts. So we can print them into patterned structures, and then we can transfer them to an aqueous environment. And the example on the bottom just shows some liver cells. If we go to the next slide, this shows that we can print stem cells that will eventually turn into neurons. So these again are printed into a 3D network, and then they're held in 3D culture for many days. So as you go from left to right here, you can see these cells maturing into neurons. So they put out processes that you can see very clearly in the bottom right hand panel. So the next slide, I think that insert just shows how these processes grow over a 2-week period. So I'll go to the next slide. And these networks of cells are functional, so we can look at their electrical activity by monitoring calcium oscillations using a fluorogenic dye. And not only are these cells electrically active, they also interact with each other. So you see these correlated calcium oscillations that occur over long distances, and that's shown in the network on the bottom right hand part of this slide. So finally, we can take these synthetic tissues and the printed cells, and we can make hybrids between them. And the way we do that is shown on the following slide. So what we'd like to do is mimic the gap junctions that are found between living cells. So cells can be electrically connected by these gap junction proteins. So what we've done, as shown on the next slide, is make take our favorite protein pore that I showed you earlier, use that, genetically engineer that to make a dimer from this pore. So it has two membrane spanning regions, and then as you can see in these electron micrographs here, and then as shown in the bottom right of this slide, we can use that to connect these two different entities and get them to interact with each other. So in summary, I hope I've been able to show you that we can make synthetic tissues, i.e. non-living materials that resemble tissues. We can also print living cells to make cellular structures by 3D printing at high resolution. We can form hybrids between these synthetic tissues and the printed living tissues. And the main goal of our lab is to exploit these materials in neurobiology and maybe use them to repair in the injured brain. It's a long-term goal. So the last slide, how might this be connected with what's happening in with this project that Phil has told you about? Well, first of all, obviously in prolonged space travel, you can't take everything with you. So we'd like to be able to create tissue patches and eventually even entire organs from the patients, i.e. the people in spacecraft, because obviously you can't take these pieces of tissue with you. And also in terms of the space station, it would be interesting to see whether we can actually do this printing in microgravity. Maybe it can even improve the printing, just as people have looked at crystallization on the space station. And we might also be able to test the ideas for prolonged space travel. Right, so thanks very much.
Hagen, thank you for that absolutely fascinating talk there. There's been a few questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, Hagen, could I ask you to have a look at the chat window if you can, and maybe address your answers to Martin there. But what an absolutely fascinating presentation there, and some beautiful visualizations as well there. As I said, for the interest of time, we're going to move to our next speaker, which is Dr. Nathan Smith. But again, thank you again, Hagen.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So Nathan is a research fellow in psychology, security and trust at the University of Manchester. He's a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and committee member of UK Space Labs. Nathan's research focuses on human behavior, performance and health under conditions of extreme stress, and this includes theoretical and applied studies relating to resilience and psychological thriving before, during and after missions in isolated, confined and extreme environments. And this will form some of what Nathan will discuss today. So Nathan, over to you, please.
Thanks, Phil. You did well reading those sentences. They were longer than I thought they were when I wrote them down. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing on the white paper. I'm going to spend a bit of time discussing the role of psychology in human spaceflight, what that means for current capability in the UK, what the submissions have been like for the white paper, and the future directions. I haven't got any slides, so unfortunately you've got to look at my face for 5 or 6 minutes. I hope that's not too distressing for you. So we've had some very good contributions so far to the white paper around psychology, human factors, neuroscience, which is the area I'm dealing with. Why is this included in the white paper specifically? So we know that psychology and the related topics have a role to play in human spaceflight. So psychology feeds in at mission planning, the assessment and selection of astronauts, training, pre-mission readiness, in-mission monitoring and countermeasure development and delivery, post-flight recovery, and then getting people ready again to fly on the next missions, hopefully. So at all phases really of the space life cycle, human psychology, the human factors around the psychology, and the neuroscience has a role to play. The UK has already demonstrated expertise in these topic areas. So in the past, colleagues from various departments have contributed to International Space Agency roadmaps for psychology and human spaceflight. So notably, colleagues at UCL were involved in the Theseus roadmap development a few years ago. And we're currently, myself and others are currently inputting to the new roadmaps that ESA are preparing for the future kind of research questions that are going to inform Moon and Mars missions eventually. So we have this sort of expertise that's sought after by these agencies, but there's also been quite a bit of research that's gone on as well. So in the past, studies have looked at kind of basic fundamental science questions, which includes the biopsychosocial basis of stress, for example, how we monitor people and the different types of technologies that can be used, voice analysis, biomarker assessments in real time, and the different methods and measures that may eventually be applied to keep astronauts happy and healthy on the ISS in the more immediate term, but then in lunar orbit, lunar surface operations, and then Mars missions in the future. So far we've had some fantastic contributions from colleagues at the University College London, the University of Southampton, University of Gloucestershire, and the research team at Manchester Met and University of Manchester. But I know there's some topic areas that Phil and the team are particularly interested in, but if people are doing work on psychology and human spaceflight in the UK and are keen to demonstrate that expertise, then please do consider sending us something when the call comes out. We also have, there's been some interesting contributions looking at more forward-thinking issues. So people have discussed research around how we support children potentially that might be operating in the space environment in the kind of medium to long-term future. This is a topic that has had a very short shrift so far, but it's something that might need to be considered eventually. And the various technologies that might be developed to enable humans to survive and thrive off in deep space. So how artificial intelligence and robotics might have to be designed to provide a well-being supportive experience for astronauts in space. So there's increasingly a kind of move towards this kind of multidisciplinary perspective and that kind of, I guess, the broader human factors perspective. One of the things that's been fairly heavily emphasized in the contributions to this topic so far is the need to develop kind of the infrastructure, the supporting infrastructure, to make sure that we can do this work with our international partners, develop really solid collaborative relationships, and try and create this sustained capability in this area, which I think is similar across all areas, but it's something that's come through quite strong in the psychology contributions. And that might be eventually where we envisage some kind of translational center where we're doing research that benefits people on exploratory space missions, but also with clear terrestrial application. So I think from my point of view, there's lots of exciting stuff to talk about here. It's going to be a really nice thematic chapter in the white paper, and we have some really good expertise in the UK that exists.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan, for that overview as well, but also reflecting on some of the other contributions which come in from your area, from other colleagues as well. So again, with all our speakers, if you do have questions, if you do want to follow them, their details are in the proceedings booklet, so do look up from there. Just one question from Matt. So out of interest, have you asked or engaged with the British Antarctic Survey for input as they have psychological activities for remote working, Nathan?
Yeah, it's a really good suggestion. Thanks, Matt. We haven't, I don't know if we've directly contacted British Antarctic Survey on the psychology. I'm pretty sure they might have been contacted in other areas. But I don't know if we've engaged them specifically on psychology, so that's something we might do as a targeted approach in the next release. But very good suggestion.
Brilliant. Thank you for that suggestion, Matt. And Nathan, again, thank you for your contributions today. We're going to move on to our last two speakers now. So I'm just going to move on to Professor Jim Richards. So Jim is the Director of Research for the Faculty of Allied Health and Wellbeing and a research lead for the Allied Health Research Unit at the University of Central Lancashire. Professor Rich's research includes clinical application of biomechanics, the development of new assessment tools for chronic disease, conservative and surgical management of orthopedic and neural conditions, and the development of evidence-based approaches for improving clinical management and rehabilitation. So Jim today will be talking about, in this context, the future development of tools to investigate the effects of microgravity on musculoskeletal deconditioning and postural control. So Jim, if you're there, going over to you, if I'd ask you to unmute. Jim, we can see your slides just fine, but can't hear you. I don't know if you're speaking, so just to check on that one.
Hi there. I found the unmute button. I mistakenly started sharing presentation before unmuting. So, okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I'll just go into presentation mode. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my slides in presentation mode now.
I'm not seeing them in presentation mode myself, and I think I had the same issue as well. So let's try one more time. If not, maybe it might be the sort of older school version of just sliding down one by one. So,
right.
Perfect. Now we can see in presentation mode.
Lovely, lovely. It was dual monitor. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. So, yep, I'm Jim Richards, Professor of Biomechanics at University of Central Lancashire. I run the Allied Health Research Unit at UKLAN and have done for the last 16 years. And I'm also now leading a new group we've set up called the MedTech Solutions Group. Also for my sins, I'm an executive board member for the Motor Control Technical Group at the International Society of Biomechanics. So what I'm going to go through today is a little bit of, I guess, background on what we're referring to when we're talking about EMG. We've had obviously a couple of presentations that have talked about EMG a little bit already, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we can now do. I'll give you a little bit of history of how this has been used previously in space studies and also where we're going next with this technology. So what we need to think about when we're thinking about how we move, we get control signals that come from the brain, which go down into the spinal cord and then out through motor neurons to the muscles. So all of our movement obviously comes from muscle activity. Now within that muscle activity, we have individual motor unit firing rates. So we've got individual motor units which are in essence controlling the muscle fibers. And if we consider a large muscle, say like vastus lateralis, one of our thigh muscles, we're going to be having around about 600 motor units, which are all control signals or providing control signals into the muscle. And we can see these, we can measure these individual motor unit control signals. We can record them using our EMG signals. Now, usually when we're considering EMG, we consider an interference pattern. And the interference pattern is, in essence, this signal which you should see on the top right hand of the screen. So this is our normal EMG signal, but what we can do is decompose this signal to its constituent parts, which gives us far more information about how our individual motor units are behaving. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, we're wanting to find out more about what is changed with the motor control, not just whether the size of the signal has changed, which might be directly related to muscle force, but what we're trying to unpick is actually what's happening with the neuromuscular control. So, why is it now not? There we go. So there has been quite a bit of work previously on microgravity. Professor Nick Kaplan has done a number of studies around this, looking at deconditioning using intramuscular EMG. So that's where we actually put in a fine wire within the muscle itself. And obviously, he's also doing a lot of work on looking at post-mission exercise reconditioning. An area associated with this is what we now are referring to as surface decomposition. So we are going to decompose, or we can now decompose EMG signals into their constituent parts, which gives us an insight into the individual motor unit behavior. Now, this was first tried in 2005, and this was a study which was run by Carlo De Luca and a group from the Neuromuscular Research Center in Boston University. And they, in essence, took some data from one of the missions in 2005. And what they found was that if we look at the motor unit behavior, pre-flight versus post-flight on a 14-day mission, we get a change in the way the motor units behave. So we are seeing this, in essence, a flattening of this slope. So this is a deconditioning of the motor unit behavior, not just the muscle strength or muscle bulk, but the motor unit behavior is actually changing in low gravity environments. So this is was one of the first times that this has been observed, that it's not just about the magnitude of the signal or the strength, we're actually affecting the neuromuscular control systems. So if we know that we're doing this, now we've got a measurement that we can use, we can actually now monitor this. Now, back in 2005, the data that we could collect using this technique was just for static muscle contractions, what we call isometric contractions, which aren't that helpful if we're trying to monitor people with when they're actually moving. So what we're wanting to now do is expand this. So where have we gone next with this? Well, we now have this technology in sufficiently small form that these are now wearable sensors. These are small sensors that can be attached to individual muscles, for instance, over the vastus medialis or the vastus lateralis muscles in the thigh, or even one of the smaller muscles of the hand. We can also attach these sensors on. So we can do this wirelessly, and this will now enable us to look at dynamic contractions and looking at the behavior of motor units during dynamic contractions and whether these are modifiable. So what I'm going to share with you is some work which is just about to be submitted. So we're not submitted for publication yet, but we're just about to submit this. So I want to share this with you to show what we are now able to do. So what you're seeing here is different levels of contraction with somebody on an exercise machine with just doing a leg extension exercise. And what we see is the behavior of the motor units changing with different loads and different speeds. So now what we can see is that we can understand the way that load and speed, if we modify these, changes the motor unit behavior. Now, whether this will then help us to optimize rehabilitation, post-flight, or be able to monitor any degradation in motor unit behavior. So what we are looking at here is a change in the neuromuscular demand. Now that will change as somebody's motor units will potentially decondition during spaceflight or pre and post spaceflight. So there is a potential of being able to monitor this information during now dynamic exercises. So that we are now using this as a way of monitoring deconditioning. So we can look at different patient groups, and we can look at neurological disorders as well as musculoskeletal disorders. And we're using this quite routinely now in a lot of our studies to study changes in neuromuscular behavior or motor unit behavior. So we're currently using this to develop new rehabilitation protocols to try and optimize recovery with individuals with different neuromuscular deficits, spanning from neuromuscular disorders or neurological disorders through to more musculoskeletal disorders. So that's kind of the latest stuff that we're doing, which potentially offers an innovative way of measuring, as I say, neuromuscular demand or deconditioning of muscles pre and post space flight. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jim, going. And certainly, I think actually the questions here, going, I think there were some fantastic parallels from what you were discussing there in terms of body weight loading, and also to sort of the unloading stuff, which Julie was alluding to earlier. So it's really great to see that sort of up to size of the spectrum, as it were. Julie, just asked a brief question before we move on to our next speaker. So, hi, James. How are you getting participants exposed to the 10% and 20% body weight? Or is the weight of the leg extension equivalent to this? Sorry, Jim, do you have an answer to that question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I've accidentally muted again. So, yeah, so we take the body weight and we're actually getting people, this is terrestrial, so we're getting people to do a leg extension exercise and increasing the knee extension load for in relation to their body weight. So that's how we've done that in this particular case. So it's all terrestrial at this time with this work.
Perfect. Thank you there, Jim. That's fantastic. And thank you again for your talk. So if I now should just stop sharing, we will move on to our final talk of the day. We are running a little bit behind everyone, but this is our final talk, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim. So Tim is a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter and has more than 10 years experience conducting space life science research on the ISS and small satellites. His work uses small worm C. elegans as a model of spaceflight adaptation, and his talk today will be on worms in space, promoting deep space exploration and adaptation. So Tim, over to you, please.
Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. So thanks everyone for hanging around for the graveyard shift. Hopefully I won't take up too much of your time so we can all go and watch the England rugby. So I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing sending worms into space and how this might help promote the kind of bigger agenda of deep space exploration and habitation and trying to make that realistic. I like this picture on the front here because I think it perfectly captures the state of play at the moment, where the International Space Station will continue to be, it has been very important in understanding biological adaptation to the microgravity environment. But of course, at the same time, we're outward looking to revisiting the moon and ultimately getting to Mars. And they're kind of stepping stones going from one to the other. And indeed, there's the role that life sciences will play in achieving that, as well as things like technology and communications. As I had a conversation with an astronaut, ESA astronaut, Reinhard Ewald, last week, and he said, yeah, the idea that people can just fly straight to Mars is completely unrealistic. So I think the field of life sciences and achieving these goals is critical. Next slide, please. So we've been using the small, like about 1 millimeter long worm, the Canerophytis elegans, as a model of spaceflight biology. We've spoken a bunch of times on a bunch of different experiments with different aims, but one of the key things we've learned, like with other species, is that worms display a reproducible, which is the key word, genetic changes in response to spaceflight. And these generally can be classed as changes in metabolic gene expression and also cytoskeletal cell adhesion gene expressions. And so we've got these clear signatures of spaceflight adaptation that we can then take forward for targeted interventions. And crucially, we see the same changes in other animals, and this includes astronauts. So with the recent, this week, in fact, cell press package, it's quite clear that astronauts express very similar mitochondrial and cytoskeletal gene expression changes as these simple worms seem to do in flight. So they seem to be a good model for understanding how biology adapts to the flight environment. Next slide, please. So we're kind of at a stage now where we can move away from kind of relatively simple observational studies where we fly things, see what changes, and then get those signatures. And we can now start to target them for therapeutic interventions. And on our recent molecular muscle experiment that flew up in December 2019, we did exactly this. So we targeted metabolism, or we targeted the cytoskeletal system with some different interventions that, if effective in flight, should reverse that transcriptional change that we see in these worms. And that data is still being analysed because it's quite a lengthy process. But some earlier results see that we may well be getting some new mechanistic insight. With the INSEG graph here, we can see that the cell translocation from the cytosol to the nucleus of a key transcription factor, which is DAP16 or FOXO in people, seems to significantly move to the nucleus as a presumed action of increased transcriptional regulation in spaceflight. So that makes sense with what we would have hypothesized. And we continue this kind of theme with the upcoming molecular muscle 2 experiment, where we will test other signatures of spaceflight. I just mentioned the mitochondria. We're going to target some specific mitochondrial therapies to see if they're effective, and also the neurons. So we're going to continue this theme of not just observing changes in flight, but seeing if we can do something about those changes. Next slide, please. So where does space life sciences fit into the whole space arena? Well, I think it can be broadly classified as 2 key areas. One is up translation, so making us more able to safely send people to the moon and to the Mars and long duration space exploration missions. This can be at the basic biology level, so we can understand the fundamental molecular changes that occur in animals in order to give us some targeted therapeutic interventions, which is primarily the work we've been doing with our worms. But of course, space medicine, so once we know those, we can develop new therapeutic strategies that can help the organisms and hopefully humans be healthier in space. And astrobiology, so understanding the origins and evolutions of life. But it would be equally great if some of the things we find out in spaceflight could benefit people on Earth, and that's entirely feasible. So if we can down translate some of the mechanistic insights we get, some of the new drug therapies for conditions that are analogous to major problems on Earth, like Steve Harridge brought up earlier with aging and other conditions of, say, muscle wasting. If we can find interventions in space that work for, say, making muscles healthy or any physiological system healthier in space, they may well work similarly on Earth. So there can be some down translation. And another broad area is also the telemedical area. So if anything is going to work in the spaceflight, it's going to have to be administered and work remotely. And so that could also work in, say, the military arenas and remote exploration arenas on Earth. Next slide, please. So just to use a couple of our own examples where things from space can be down translated to Earth to find new mechanistic understanding. If we look at some of the genes that we first found to be altered in space, and that led us to some hypothesis-driven work on Earth, we can look at these cell adhesion complexes where we've then did some Earth-based work and comprehensively found this system where these cell adhesion molecules regulate skeletal muscle function, metabolism, and ultimate strength and movement capacity on Earth. More so, we've also looked at some of these molecules and forward translated them directly into humans with some exercise trials. And whilst the work is ongoing, some of our preliminary evidence seems to suggest that these cell adhesion complexes work in a similar way as they do both in worms and in the spaceflight area. So we think this may be a key molecular maintenance mechanism for human muscle. Next slide, please. Another example, so we saw this mitochondrial and calcium kind of signature in spaceflight, again, and then performed some more detailed mechanistic intervention studies on Earth with our Japanese collaborators, Professor Atsushi Higashitani, and found a clear mitochondrial dysfunctional route that can cause calcium overload in the cell. That in turn leads to extracellular matrix degradation, and that can cause muscle atrophy and damage. So yet again, this is a situation where things we first found in spaceflight in our own work led us to some hypothesis-driven work on Earth to find out new molecular maintenance systems, in our case for skeletal muscle. Next slide, please. So if we're going to facilitate deep space exploration from a life sciences perspective, we're going to need to do biology experiments outside of the ISS. And that's going to require new hardware that can be flown on small satellites, or say some of the upcoming planned deep space missions like the European Large Logistics Lander or Mars Samples Return. And these technologies, some do exist, but the kind of experimental capacity is relatively low. So we've been developing what we're calling the fluorescent deep space petripod, which is a miniaturized system about the size of a large matchbox, which has heaters, it has temperature sensors, it has fluorescent imaging capabilities. And we can see on the right here, even though that's not fluorescence imaging, we can see some worms in our well there with relatively simple Raspberry Pi camera setup. So the resolution still needs optimizing, but we can see fluorescence in other images as well. So we've got a kind of miniaturized system where we can thaw out, warm up, keep at a stable temperature. Hopefully, we're going to fly that soon on this worm sail on a CubeSat, hopefully next year, where we can start to develop this whole idea of being able to send biological samples on deep space exploration missions, which at present isn't necessarily achievable. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up then, I mean, part of this whole idea of the Space Lab and the white paper is what can the UK do and where does the health space life sciences kind of arena fit together? And I think the UK are very well placed to be at the forefront of the future of space life sciences. We have an excellent life sciences base in the UK per se, but in the spaceflight arena even more so. This is kind of epitomised, if you like, by this week's Cell press package by GeneLab, which we had several papers as part of that. We're also part of the ESA Space Omics topical team, and they had a paper in it too. So there's a really good UK science foundations for this. And if we can also combine that with the engineering strengths that we have here, to say take things like our FDSPP model, add into that microfluidics, maybe link it up with the nanopore technology for like in-flight sequencing, and even other tissues like the synthetic biology and other organisms can be tested in flight, then we can really put ourselves at the forefront of technology for being able to do this work. And similarly, the commercial space sector is expanding. We have things like people like Kaiser Space in the UK and other companies like IceCubes and NanoRacks that are all these commercial opportunities for accessing space. And with the spaceport that's been planned, we could maybe make the UK established as kind of the place for space life sciences research, or at least put us right at the front of the cutting edge of the discipline. Thank you.
Brilliant, and that was a fantastic presentation as well. There's some really great questions there, which is always helps thinking. And as someone's mentioned already, a fantastic overview of going of C. elegans and also how they can be used to look more into the important words of genomics and genetics and exploring UK space science exploration. So thank you for your presentation. We have come to time now, everyone, but just to draw yourself to a few things just before I hand over to Zainab to close session. So Rochelle's already put some links in the chat channel. So if you'd like to continue this conversation offline, a Slack channel has been opened to allow you to more informally share some thoughts and ideas and network a bit further. But also, I know we didn't get a chance to look at Professor Kate Robson-Brown's slides earlier, but if you look again in the chat window, there's a link to the Google Drive there, and you can access those slides directly from there. So I do encourage you to have a look at those for some fantastic oversights there. So again, I just want to just say thank you again to all our speakers. And before I hand over to Zainab, say a special thank you to the UK Space Labs organising team, Zainab, Nina, and Shreya, and also the SJC team. You've done a fantastic job. And just from me and the white paper contributors so far, we've really enjoyed this conversation. If anyone would like to learn more about the white paper, get involved, we'll send you those links to the team to pass out. But thank you for inviting us to this webinar today. Zainab, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to all the key contributors for that really insightful segment. I really enjoyed it. So to conclude today's webinar, I just want to say thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for taking the time out to speak to us today. And thank you to everyone who attended. We've had some really good questions and some nice discussions in the chat as well, and some great papers and places where you can get more involved and talk more about this topic. So thank you all for that. And I also want to say thank you to Shreya and Nina for co-organising this event. You can see on the screen there's a booklet for today's event where you can access all the speakers' information and their contact details as well, so their Twitter handles and their emails. And also please do fill out the feedback form that's on the screen. The QR code's on the screen, and I've put it in the chat as well. We really want to hear your feedback, and it's a way for you to get a certificate to say that you've attended today. So yeah, thank you for attending. Please do follow us, UK Space Labs and SJC on Twitter. I've got our LinkedIn and also an email address in case you have any questions or want to get involved. So thank you so much for attending, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of your day.